Lightsaber forms are an essential part of dueling. Without them, the Jedi and Sith would just be swinging their lightsabers like baseball bats and not the elegant weapons that they are. Typically, a Jedi or Sith would be trained in one or more lightsaber forms, and would use those forms for their entire lives, but some absolute Giga Chads would master all 7 forms. But what were every lightsaber forms in Star Wars? I already have made a video about this topic a long time ago, but that video, frankly, was not good. So I wanted to make an updated version where I discuss those, as well as the forbidden lightsaber forms as well. So without further ado, let's get on to the video. Starting with Form 1 Shicho, also known as the Determination form or the Way of the Sarlacc. This form was the oldest and the first to be created. This form was created around the same time the Jedi and Sith shifted from using middle swords into lightsabers. And because it was created in that time period, it was mainly toned for their time and taught the basic marks and techniques of lightsaber combat. Some of the target zones were the following: left side, right side, head, and legs. Form 1 was the foundation in which all the other forms were built upon. It was not ideal for blaster deflection or lightsaber combat, but rather a superior, well-rounded form. It was typically the form that many Jedi would fall back on if needed. This form was also the first to be taught to the Jedi Padawans. But even though it wasn't the primary choice for many Jedi, there was some very powerful Jedi who used this Form 1 as their main lightsaber form, such as Kit Fisto. The next lightsaber form, Form 2, Makushi, or the Concentration form, was revered as one of the most elegant of all the forms. It was the next lightsaber form to be made, quickly replacing Form 1. This was the preferred fighting style for lightsaber to lightsaber combat, and because of this, it was mostly utilized during the days where the Sith were a constant threat. Makushi emphasized persistent strikes as well as well-balanced footwork. While it could be used with both hands, it was preferred as a one-handed form. A master of Makushi could quickly end any fight by penetrating an opponent's defense and landing a few critical hits on them. Makushi was also most effective against a single opponent, but if the practitioner was incredibly skilled, they could easily hold their own against multiple opponents. Following Form 2, we have Form 3, Soru, also known as the Resilience form or the Way of the Mynock. Soru was the ultimate form of defense, and those who master it were said to be undefeatable in combat. Soru is the most inward form out of the rest, because in order for a master to utilize it and use it at its fullest, the practitioner must be able to remain centered and calm in all situations and keep a clear head. Unlike Makushi, Form 3 was the ideal form for deflecting blaster bolts, and could easily take on dozen opponents at once by entering a state of moving meditation, which heightened their senses and which allowed them to intercept and block blaster fire. And when attacking an opponent, the user would most of the time retreat into a defensive cocoon, making it increasingly difficult for the aggressor to land an attack. But this did come at the cost of not being able to mount a counterattack. But if done correctly, the opponent would have tired themselves out, thus leading them to slip up and allowing a Form 3 master to win. Form 4 Ataru, or otherwise known as the Aggression form or the Way of the Hawkbat, was a very fast and acrobatic pasted form. It required its practitioner to almost be on a constant offensive, and the acrobatic nature of the form was best suited for Jedi who possessed talents for receiving their speed and stamina via the Force. This typically meant that the Jedi who had higher Force sensitivity were more likely to choose this form and would be better at it than, say, someone with lower Force sensitivity. But even with enhanced stamina, Form 4 quickly tired out its practitioner due to its exhausting nature, and this was best used for quick fights. Ataru also required its users to be constantly flipping around and twisting and turning, thus making it seem like it was a blur of lunges and leaps. A skilled user of Form 4 could also use the Force to heighten their jumps, making them jump higher and faster. Similar to Makushi, Form 4 was best used against a single opponent, and unless a true master of Ataru, the Jedi are recommended to also study Form 3, Soru. The next form, Form 5, was sort of like a 2-in-1 form. There's Shen and DMO, otherwise known as the Perseverance form or the Way of the Crate Dragon. This form was mostly used as an offense, but could also be utilized as a defense as well. These two forms, while different, were similar in many ways. The first variation of this was Shen. This form was typically used alongside the reverse grip lightsaber. This variation focused more on the defensive side of combat and wearing down their opponent to open them up for an attack. And unlike Soru, the user had to be ready at any moment to switch from a defense to an offense in a matter of moments, and return to that defense once they exerted a lot of energy. The other version of Form 5 was DMO, and this variation was a lot more aggressive than Shen. It was primarily used for solid blocks and parries of a lightsaber, then immediately launching a counter-strike. Like its counterpart in Makushi, this form was best used for lightsaber-to-lightsaber combat, but as we've seen with many Jedi, as well as Anakin, it was also very effective against blaster bolts. Unlike many of the other forms, Form 5 sought to control the battle and use their environment around them to help them win against their opponent. The next form, Form 6, Nimon, also known as the Moderation form and the Way of the Rancor, also had the nickname of the Diplomat's form. This was because it was the preferred fighting style of Jedi counselors, who sought peace and only to use aggression when forced. Unlike the other forms, Nimon was a very well-rounded form. It combined the other forms to create a hybrid. Nimon overshadowed many of the other forms due to being viewed as the best form for everything, but while it did have a combination of all the forms combined, it did lack their mastery and led many to consider it being incomplete. And this was mostly true. It wasn't the ideal form for blaster deflection or lightsaber combat, but it was well-rounded enough where it was effective. Nimon was also the preferred style for twin blades. The art of wielding a sword in each hand was most commonly known as Jakar, which is the form we saw Ahsoka use. It was typically for those who wished to have a second blade, most of the time used a lightsaber shoto in their offhand, because it was shorter and allowed for a greater range of motion. And the next form, Form 7, Yuyo, or the Veracity form. This form may have existed for thousands of years, but is undoubtedly the most controversial form among all the other lightsaber forms. Due to it being very vicious and unpredictable, it was banned by the Jedi Order and was only ever to be trained if given direct permission by the Jedi Council. The reason it was viewed as very dangerous was because in order to use it in its full potential, the user had to draw heavily on the dark side of the Force and draw on their emotions. And most of the time, this would cause the practitioner to fall to the dark side of the Force. This form was also the most aggressive out of all the lightsaber forms, and since it required its user to draw on the dark side and use their emotions, this was seen as a direct violation of the Jedi Code, and therefore was banned. Form 7 was also very difficult to master. Its movements were sharp and chaotic, and often occurred in quick bursts. We will now be moving on to the forbidden lightsaber forms, starting off with Vaapad. Unlike many of the lightsaber forms, Vaapad was the newest and was created mere decades before the dreaded Jedi Purge by Master Mace Windu. This variation did do the most with the dark side of the Force and required its users to draw heavily on it. Mace Windu created this variation in order to control and recognize his inner darkness, using their emotions. And because the practitioner had to use their emotions to utilize this in its fullest potential, it opened the gate to allow their inner darkness to control them. But not letting themselves completely be taken over by the dark side was very difficult to do, due to them needing to give themselves over to the thrill of battle and enjoying fighting. And because of this, it was almost never taught to anyone besides Mace Windu and his Padawans. Vaapad was also seen more as a state of mind than a fighting style. And the next form was the form of Trakata. This was one of the only lightsaber forms that the Jedi and Sith both agreed should never be used. Not because it was so powerful, but rather it was viewed as a coward's form. Trakata took advantage of the lightsaber's ability to be turned off and turned on pretty fast and used it during a battle. When used, it allowed the user to turn off the lightsaber in the heat of battle and place it in a weak point in the opponent. The Jedi refused to use this ability because it was seen as a direct violation of their code and incredibly unsportsmanlike. And the Sith viewed this as a cheap move, and as a symbol of incredible weakness. In their eyes, a true master should be able to overpower and defeat an opponent using only the dark side and a lightsaber, and not relying on dirty tricks. Which is ironic because this is the Sith we're talking about. And speaking of irony, this form was actually created by a Jedi counselor, and a counselor, for those of you who don't know, was mostly recognized as someone who sought peace and not violence. And this form undoubtedly was the one that caused the most violence. Even though it was downright forbidden for the Jedi to use, this didn't stop many Jedi from using this form, but only in extreme dire situations. But these were the forms during and before the Jedi Purge, and as we know, so much information was lost to the Empire, which does include many of these lightsaber forms. This would affect Luke Skywalker when he attempted to rebuild the Jedi Order. So to combat this, he would create 3 new lightsaber forms, the first of which was known as the Strong Style. This form, as the name suggests, focused on using very powerful and strong strikes to break down the opponent and eventually destroy their defense. But this did come at the cost of speed and agility. This style, though, was incredibly effective against melee attackers at close range. But because this form was slow, it also made the practitioners vulnerable to many counter-strikes and to some blaster fire. The second form was the Medium Style. This was a form that strived to find a balance between speed and power. And like Shicho, it was typically the first form to be taught at the new Jedi Order. And like Shicho, it was simple yet effective. It was a foundation for multiple future forms. This form was also very well rounded and provided good offense and defense. But this form was largely ineffective against skilled warriors. The final form to be taught by Luke's new Jedi Order was the Fast Style. This form primarily focused on quick, short, and fast attacks. And similar to Form 4 Ataru, it was very effective in melee attacks, but also very effective at deflecting blaster fire as well, and also had a very strong defense. We will now be moving on to the more unique lightsaber forms, starting with the mounted combat. This form was solely used in riding from a saddle. This form could have involved anything ranging from a speeder bike to an animal. The practitioner, though, must learn how to take advantage of the higher elevation to attack opponents. Unlike many other forms, this wasn't a primary form, but rather a temporary one if the opportunity presented itself. There also was a Soken form, or more commonly known as a high ground form. This style utilized the surrounding terrain as a weapon and primarily seek the high ground or taking cover behind obstacles. And as we've seen with Obi-Wan Kenobi, this was very effective against opponents who overestimated their power. The next form is a saber throw, but this isn't really technically a lightsaber form, but rather a technique they could use. So I'm not going to talk about it, but I will mention it because it does sort of count as a technique. And finally, we have Trip Zest. This was also known as the flying lightsaber style. This particular form was used by species who could fly naturally or artificially. Users of this form would locate and target and quickly drop down from the sky away and attack their opponents, in hopes of decapitating them by swinging their lightsabers around in a fury of strikes. And after the attack was over, they would retreat right back to the sky. This form also used many aspects of Form 7 Yuyo. And that is the updated version of every lightsaber form, plus the forbidden forms as well. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and a special thank you for Squishy Yawn for giving me this awesome video idea. If you want me to create one of your ideas, let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and with that, my fellow Star Wars nerds, may the Force be with you.